With me today is Professor Gerald Conlogue, co-director of the Bioanthropology Research Institute and emeritus professor at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, to discuss the museum's investigation of its Egyptian mummy, utilizing medical diagnostic imaging technologies. Professor Conlogue, could you tell us a little bit about how you and your Quinnipiac University colleagues, Professor Ron Beckett and Bill Hennessy, came to work with us at the Barnum Museum?
Well, first, Adrian, thank you for letting me participate in this exciting story. I was hired in 1992 at Quinnipiac to direct the diagnostic imaging program. My primary responsibility was to train students to take images of living patients in the hospital environment. But for the preceding 30 years, my research interests were in non-traditional applications of medical imaging. My feeling was that by training students to operate outside the hospital environment, where we didn't have to worry about radiation protection to the patient, that they could practice their skills as radiographers to acquire images of very unusual objects. This was one of the reasons they hired me at Quinnipiac, and I started teaching non-traditional imaging courses at Quinnipiac, including forensic imaging, because I also work at the medical examiner's office for the state of Connecticut in Farmington. In 1999, Ron Beckett and I formed the Bioanthropology Research Institute at Quinnipiac University. Ron's background was in respiratory care. So he had used instruments like endoscopes, tiny cameras, to look inside the body. With the X-ray, I could look through the body. The objective was to take medical imaging procedures that had been done for decades, modify them, and apply them to non-medical situations. In '92, I started working again at the Barnum Museum in Philadelphia and the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. But what I really wanted to do was to get involved with the Barnum, because it's only about 30 miles down the road and I wouldn't have to drive to Pennsylvania or DC. I had sent letters to the Barnum and there was no response. We thought, well, it's probably not going to happen. I'm not sure, but it may have been that Kathy saw an episode of the Roadshow or heard about the Roadshow and contacted us. And then I contacted her and the topic of the mummy came up. I think that's how it is.
Yes, I believe in 2006, our executive director, Kathy Marr, was watching the Mummy Roadshow that you and Ron Beckett were co-hosts of, and listening to it and hearing or seeing perhaps on the screen that you were from Quinnipiac University. She said, "Oh my goodness, they're just right up the road from us in Bridgeport."
I recall that we had a discussion about what was here, and it suddenly came up, there's a mummy. Everyone was very enthusiastic about having us participate in this. So Bill and I took care of the X-ray end of things. We primarily used portable equipment to transport the equipment to where the remains were. It's just dangerous to try to move an object like a mummy because they're fragile. So we wanted to make sure they were stable, and the best way to do that is using conventional X-ray. And then Ron would use his endoscope to look inside if there was an opening to see if the interior matched what we were looking at on the X-rays.
You've had years of examining mummies. I understand have examined maybe 1,000 mummies over the course of the years, along with Professor Beckett?
Approximately 1,000, 1,500 mummies in 13 countries other than the United States. So we've had vast experience. Because of our association with National Geographic Channel, we were able to meet and work with experts in different areas around the world. Our expertise is to acquire images, either with the camera, the endoscope, or with the X-ray unit, and then turn those images over to radiologists, physicians who have been trained specifically to look at the shadows you see on X-rays, and anthropologists, those people who study the background or the cultures associated with the remains. So our job is to collect data that's hidden within the remains. And what we try to do is get the mummy to tell us their story.
So how did this project start? You made the contact finally in 2006 with the Barnum Museum, and I understand Professor Hennessy spoke to the people at Advanced Radiology in Fairfield and made the connection there so that CT scanning could be done. Can you just explain briefly what CT scanning really is?
Initially, what we do are take plain radiographs or endoscopic images to determine if the mummified remains are stable. Once they're stable, we want to get better resolution. So think of X-rays as two-dimensional images of a three-dimensional object, kind of like a snapshot. But they're superimposition, so if we're X-raying from the back to the front, everything is superimposed, so we can't really separate objects within the mummy. With computed tomography, CT scanning, the body is actually sectioned from top to bottom, and we can look at these slices and even put them back together to get a three-dimensional orientation of what's inside the object. At the time, in 2006, we did not have a CT unit at Quinnipiac, but we had portable X-ray equipment. So we came to the Barnum, we were able to radiograph the mummy, determined that it was stable enough to be transported. Quinnipiac University has 30 clinical sites that they send students, both hospitals and private imaging practices. And the practice in Fairfield, the outpatient practice in Fairfield, was more than happy to get involved in this project. It would provide their techs an opportunity, again, to do something that was a little bit unusual, but also get some publicity for the imaging center. And in today's economy, it's really important for all these places to get as much positive publicity as possible, and this provided that opportunity.
So when the mummy was transported to Advanced Radiology in Fairfield, which is just the next town over from Bridgeport, not far to go, but very carefully transported, did you have any ideas about what you might find as a result of the scanning?
One of the things that's really good about having people like us who acquire images, we usually don't go in with any kind of expectations. So we're not looking for anything specifically. We're trying to get just the best possible images that could be used by other experts. We brought the mummy in, it had the CT scan, and the radiologist there was taking a look at the radiographs as they were coming up. But Ron and I were occupied with the technologist who was in the process of trying to put together 3D images. The radiologist, who had never seen the inside of a mummy before, thought that a body packet that was kind of cylindrically shaped, the radiologist, who may have gone to the Met or someplace and saw a falcon mummy, thought that this was a falcon, and this he reported to the media. It stirred up a tremendous amount of excitement. At the time, Ron and I did not know this had transpired. It was the next day when it was in the media. And that's one of the reasons why we try to be very open-minded about this and then show the images at least to an anthropologist to say, what's this? Because of our experiences with National Geographic and working with Egyptian mummies, we did not believe that there was any instant when an animal mummy was placed inside a human. So we thought that was totally wrong, but we had to check with anthropologists about this. Now, that really was helpful for us, and I'll get back to that in a second. We actually go into all these examinations. Even now, I've done this for over 30 years. I still don't go in with any preconceived ideas about what I'm going to see. You know, again, it's like opening that package on Christmas. I'm surprised and delighted at everything I see. I may try to guess what I'm looking at, but again, because of my medical training in the background, I'm very cautious about jumping to conclusions, especially something like, oh, that's a bird inside there. But what we did find was that there were packets inside the individual. The teeth were in terrible shape. She may have had as many as 17 abscesses that were active at the time of her death. So she had dental pathology. The other thing that we were able to determine that this was not an old person. They were more than 21 years old at the time of their death because their bones had completely formed. In a person under that age, the ends of the bones are not completely fused to the bone yet to permit longitudinal growth so that you can get taller. Her bones were definitely sealed off. They were definitely, the epiphyses were closed, the end plates. So there weren't a lot of arthritic changes, particularly with her spine. So that meant she had to be under 40 or 50. So what we came up with initially was a range. She was over 21 and under 40. The radiologist would have to go through and then try to narrow that range down a little bit. She had, as I mentioned, organ packets within the body, which was very typical of a particular period in Egyptian history. We also determined initially that it was a female, that it was not a male. And that was confirmed on the 3D reconstructions because what we could do is look at the surface of the body. The surface reconstruction of the pelvic region demonstrated without a doubt that this was a female and not a male.
This was an extraordinary discovery or learning process for the museum, certainly, which had interpreted the mummy as a 60-year-old male priest. And now the scans show something quite different. This is a female, this is a much younger individual. So it must have been an extraordinary moment, to realize that perhaps the coffin that the mummy had been transported in to this country did not really belong to her.
Well, apparently during this period in history, when people went and purchased mummies to bring home as souvenirs, it was kind of a mix and match process. You pick the mummy you like, you pick the coffin you like, and you just put them together. There was no provenance for what was on the coffin to match what was inside the contents.
We had this understanding from the CT scanning of some elements of the person whose remains we had in our care, but you were curious to learn more, and perhaps the potential of there being a bird, a mummified bird inside the body was what led to a next stage of the study with much higher equipment, more state-of-the-art equipment at Quinnipiac. Can you tell us a little bit about how we get from the discoveries of 2006 to a second stage in 2010?
Well, fortunately for Quinnipiac, in 2009, we entered into an agreement with Toshiba Medical Imaging, and we were able to acquire a CT unit that would be dedicated at the university to train students. Now, one of the things that happened back in 2006, the mummy was scanned using protocols or procedures that would have been used on a live patient. If you're doing a live patient, you want to minimize the amount of radiation to the patient because radiation can be harmful. Instead of taking thin slices, you take thick slices. You only can get certain representations within a slice. If you take thinner slices, you can get a better representation as to what's located within that section of tissue. When we went in 2006, we had no control over the protocols that were used. But when Quinnipiac got the CT scanner in 2009, one of the things we wanted to do is develop CT protocols that could be used on mummified or skeletal remains. So there were two reasons why we were very anxious to redo the mummy at the Barnum. First of all, to take a look with higher resolution, but also to develop techniques and procedures, protocols, that could be used in other locations in the country or around the world for mummified remains. So it was very important for us to get this mummy back. However, the mummy was done. Why would we do this over? The bird was the hook. So just because the radiologist said there was a bird in there, and that created a media storm. It provided us the opportunity, in true Barnum fashion, to re-examine the mummified remains to see if there was actually a bird there. We knew there wasn't a bird in there, but we were going to use that as the hook to be able to re-examine this mummy.
So that was quite unplanned, but really worked in our favor to allow for this re-examination of the mummy with the much higher resolution equipment. And I guess we should explain that the presence of a bird within a mummified human, and specifically if it was something like a falcon, would have been a sign that the individual was royal. Was that true?
To my knowledge, and I'm not an expert or Egyptologist, there has never been an instance where an animal, a mummified animal, bird, or anything else, has been put inside the human remains. My belief is that animal mummies were put in the tombs with the mummified adult as more of votive offerings, or so that when they went to the other side, it would be populated by a lot of animals or objects that they were familiar with. So in no instance had it ever been recorded that a mummified bird specifically was put inside an adult mummy.
I understand that students from one of the local high schools, it was Trumbull's Agri-Science and Biotech High School, actually came to witness this second scanning work at Quinnipiac. Can you just tell me a little bit about that experience? Because, you know, you're a university, and this project was intended not only to learn about the mummy, but as you said, establish protocols and, you know, expose students to this new technology.
As you mentioned, as Quinnipiac is a university, our primary goal is to teach students. So, of course, our imaging students were present learning on how to operate the equipment, but we also wanted to provide an opportunity for high school students, because maybe this would spur their interest in science, in anthropology, Egyptology, or even diagnostic imaging. So if you could give someone a taste, spark their interest in something, that may help them decide a career path in the future. So we always like to get students involved. High school students, even middle school students, have come to the university during a number of these projects.
It's kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for those students to witness a mummy scan like that.
Well, this is one of the really exciting things for me. I mean, we do a lot of non-traditional. It's not only mummies or skeletal remains, but we do artifacts, pottery, or whatever. But with the mummy, what I think is so incredible, this was actually a person who walked the earth 2,000 plus years ago. You're right next to him. And you have an opportunity to try to get them to tell their story. You know, what secrets do they have inside? A lot of that information is hidden in the images. So you just have to find the best protocol or procedure to be able to bring that information out. And I think students are particularly excited if the people who are instructing them are very excited about the subject matter. So if you're with us when we're doing one of these things, you know, it's kind of like kids on Christmas morning opening up the package.
Wow, wow. We talked about the age of this woman, perhaps being 30 to 40 years old, roughly. But what about the time period in which she lived? Is there a way to determine what era of ancient Egyptian history she lived in, and how does that correspond to the approximate date of the coffin, since we know that they did not belong to one another?
One of the types of data that we're able to collect are location of incisions, materials that may be packed inside the body, position of the extremities. So all of that, an Egyptologist would be able to give you a fairly specific range of dates that this mummy came from. I think you've had Egyptologists look at this material and they've given you those dates.
It seemed that she could be considerably earlier, potentially, than the coffin that she came to this country inside. So, and there are different, you have looked at so many different mummies, you've seen different techniques used in different time periods. Is that correct?
We've probably seen at least a dozen or more Egyptian mummies around the States, and I did work in Cairo in 2000 at the museum there and looked at more mummified remains. And she does certainly fit into a category of mummies that predate the date estimated for the coffin.
It certainly takes a lot of specialists to kind of assemble information. As you say, you are collecting the image data. An Egyptologist might look at the remains to get a closer idea of the date, the time period in which the person had lived. Tell me a little bit about the team, the ideal team that you would see to help most accurately interpret a mummy like we have. I mean, it's understanding that our technologies advance, our understanding of culture, ancient cultures, and customs and practices of the time are always evolving too. But what's the ideal team of experts that you see for helping the Barnum Museum reinterpret our Egyptian mummy?
Well, Ron Becca and I are proponents of what we call a diagnosis by consensus. Again, we come from a medical background where it's a team that helps make a diagnosis. So you need specialists to operate the equipment. Most of the equipment now is software driven. So to keep up with changes in software, you really need someone who specializes in acquiring the images. So that's why you need radiographers to operate the equipment, or someone to operate the endoscope who's familiar with the different applications and how to optimize the acquisition of images. But then you need an anthropologist, someone who understands the particular cultural background of that individual and what may have been happening during that period in history. You need a radiologist to interpret the shadows or the pattern that they see on the images, because this is just really pattern recognition. However, most radiologists are trained to look at live patients. In mummified remains, organs change the position. In an Egyptian mummy, the organs are removed, put in body packets. So it takes a little training for the radiologist with the help of the anthropologist to be able to interpret the images. And then we go for a specialist, possibly in pathology. For this particular mummy, we had a dental radiologist look at the dentition. So you want to get specialists in as many areas as possible where you can sit down and discuss the findings. And we use the term diagnosis by consensus because you may not come up with one hard, fast, this is it. You know, it's one of those things where you might be able to debate a little, but you feel comfortable in what you are stating is the conditions that you're seeing on the images.
In the case of our mummy, where she seems to have been a relatively young woman at the time she died, yet her teeth were extremely worn, and as you mentioned, it appeared she had many dental abscesses. Is it unusual to be able to identify, maybe not conclusively, but point to a possible cause of death like this?
Well, this was truly an unusual case. Because we had acquired those images in 2009 with such high resolution, we were able to send the data set that included the head to the dental radiologist, Alan Lurie at the University of Connecticut. And he was able to put together three-dimensional reconstructions that were outstanding. If we had used the data from 2006, it would not have been as detailed. So he thought this was by far the worst he had ever seen. And depending on the location of the abscess, that infection could actually migrate to the brain. So an infection in your dentition could actually contribute to your death through septicemia. Blood, the bacteria gets into your circulatory system, to your organs, and it can actually kill you. So we don't have a hard, fast, this is what caused her death, but there's strong circumstantial evidence that this contributed to her death. Most physicians who have trained in this country will have never seen a patient's condition deteriorate to the point, let's say, that this particular mummy, and particularly because this would have been an individual who probably had some wealth, so they would have sought treatment. But in her case, there was no treatment, and she probably succumbed from the dental pathology.
It's very sad to think about that because, of course, it must have been horrifically painful, whether or not it killed her. But certainly, as you say, it could have contributed to her demise at that relatively young age.
Well, we also found caries. So if you've ever had a cavity and just trying to take in air over that tooth is extremely painful. So multiply that 10, 20 times, and this is what it would have been like for her. It would have been extremely painful. And she lived for quite some time with that condition.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share about that you learned from these images from 2010, especially in comparison to other Egyptian mummies that you've studied?
What's important, because this is one individual, and now those images are being shared, because everything is collected electronically now. We could easily share those images with radiologists or Egyptologists in Egypt or anywhere around the world. So this particular mummy is contributing to the body of information that we know about mummies in general, Egyptian mummies specifically. So she's contributing to the body of knowledge we have about Egyptian mummies.
We have you to thank in no small measure for leading us to this point. We are continuing on our path of discovery, and it's all very exciting, and we're very grateful for the role that you and Professor Beckett and Professor Hennessy played in leading us along this journey. It's been quite extraordinary, and we thank you very much.
Well, thank you.